All right. Hello and welcome. We're talking about design space this week, and I'm going to hit you with that patented pre-cap. This video is going to be a two-parter. We got, well, I kind of went off on a couple things because I don't think this first part really gets at everything that I wanted. So I'll cover what we did hit in this first part, and then I will upload the second part, which is going to be more of me just kind of like rambling and talking about stuff. So we start off by getting at core aspects of your game, which is kind of what we distilled down from our video last week. And then we talk about how those aspects are interacted with by the player, because that kind of defines where you're going to start building from, and the different components of your aspects. And then I talk a lot about health as an example, basically like how the design of health systems functions in different games, and how you can kind of break that down and use that thought process to help you analyze different components of your aspects. And then I briefly go over positive, neutral, negative framework. In like you create a general neutral class of just like all the base stuff is all set to a central number, and then you can just kind of play around with it, either in a positive or a negative aspect, and then that just kind of helps you build out ideas. And then you can push those numbers to extremes after you kind of figure out what you're starting to build, to find breaking points and find like kind of your grounded base to start. So you can find like the healthy, neutral, fair point, but then also the like fun extreme sides of things. And that's pretty much it for this first part. The second part is going to be me talking about how design space is more than just this, because this is kind of like a good place to get started, but there's a lot more to it and a lot more depth into how and why and what you're doing with design space. So hopefully you sit through it and enjoy it and learn stuff from it. I would like to get into the design space on a bunch of stuff, but we'll get into that in future videos. So yeah, enjoy. So this week I want to talk about design space, because I think it's kind of the next step in where we're going. So after last week where we talked about ideas and brainstorming and like your design pillars to help kind of boil down what your like larger concept is into, you know, your core aspects. So you're going to use these as sort of like your solid points to build from, because it's difficult to look at a blank canvas and just come up with stuff. So it's easier to kind of like have restraints in place to build off of. So this helps you avoid, I don't know if there's a term for that, but just like the blank canvas block. And constraints help with creativity as well. And that's why you see with like game jams and like Inktober. Let me write this really quick. activity. Okay. So yeah, getting prompts and stuff helps kind of just like let your brain latch onto something, and then you're able to iterate from there. So that's basically what we're trying to do by getting to these core aspects. And then design space is that room in between your pillars. So these are your dots are your core aspects, and the design space is what's in here, in between them. Design space. And then you roughly have, your total game idea space here, but these are kind of like your core points. So like if you wanted to make like a 2D action game that is based on exploration and has simple combat and is like art focused, because let's say you come from more of an art background, so you just want to have a place for people to go and explore and kind of like deal with some minor threats, but it's more of like a chill game. So the design space is going to be how you're going to interact with these systems, and what kind of like builds bridges between them. And so that more or less gets to where I wanted to talk about next, which is how the player interacts with your game. Because this is going to be the place where they have agency, and it's going to be where they'll feel depth to the game. There is, so like if you are doing something that's more environmental, making sure the environment has ways to like give feedback to the player gives depth and stuff like that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like how I press the A button. It can be other stuff, but what the player is directly interacting, what the player is supposed to be getting from your game, that's what you kind of want to build off of. And so what the player is going to be running into the most is what you should be building around. And then you want to think about what these interactions allow for and don't allow for. Let's go with do/don't allow for, which is a terrible sentence, but whatever. So like in an exploration game where it gives a lot of stuff to look at, but it doesn't necessarily provide like puzzle aspects or something like that. Like you just kind of need to understand the limitations of what you're working with, because you can either choose to accentuate what it does, accent what it does, or you can try and bend it to do what it normally doesn't. And I don't really have an example for that offhand, but it's where you're kind of like just trying to force something to do what it isn't normally meant to do. And this, what's coming to mind initially for me is like the Pokemon games, where you have like the different stats to your Pokemon, and so like something might be a physical attacker because it has a better physical attack stat, but its special attack isn't terrible, so how would you like build something to use its special attack or something like that? So by kind of subverting what people are expecting, you can create interest there. And I don't have like an overall game idea for that, but like that sort of a thing, like I said, can generate interest for people. So this is all kind of generic. And I kind of have to word it this way because there's just so many aspects that you can be coming at a game from, but you can build off of tropes that already exist in games. Build off existing tropes. And what I mean by this is things like like health, stamina, so like those general bars, like civilizations in like the Civ series, or like the Age of Empires, things like that. I lost my pen. Civilizations. And like, oops. Weapons. Etc. I'm running out of space here. But just like, just kind of go with generic stuff to start off with, because this will help you just kind of figure out the basics, and it's easier to just kind of slap something in and then tweak it from there. It's easier to understand for both you as the designer and the player, because most people are used to interacting with some sort of health system. If it's or an adventure game, there's going to be some sort of weapon and stuff like that. And so it makes it easier for people to kind of like jump in and just, attach what they already know to the game. But then you're able to you can riff off of these standard items to kind of like get to what's interesting about your game. But you're going to want to, you want to do these things in a new way. You don't want to just like make another Dark Souls game. Like you don't want to just make another Spelunky or whatever. Like you need to make something that's gonna stand out or be different. It's not that everything has to be completely different. Like you don't have to reinvent the health bar, but like you want to ask yourself, is there a way to express that A kind of disappeared, way to express these differently. Ooh. Squeak that in there. And kind of like the best way to go about doing that is to kind of ask yourself what is it doing? What is it doing? And like why does it work in its own context? So like I don't know, there's literally tons of examples. Like, what's coming to mind is, like I said, Dark Souls, something like why the dodge roll works, why the bonfires work, things like that. What is the function of it? But the idea that I had before I got started was health systems, and so I'm gonna talk about that up over here. So, example time. Example time. So health. So basically, health has like a handful of different roles in games. I did want to do kind of like a deeper talk on this, but I'll hit some higher points on it. So there's kind of like 4 different versions of health that get shown in games. So there's progressive power-ups, and this is things like the Mario games. So like the mushroom makes you bigger and it gives you an extra hit, but if you're small and you get hit, then you're dead. Then we have med kits / pickups, and this is kind of like Zelda or Doom. I guess the first Halo kind of does this as well, but you kind of have a certain number of hits that you can take. I don't know, like you have health bars, but then you have like med kits that kind of give you percentages of that health back. So it's kind of like a split health bar. And then you have like the traditional health bar of, you know, like the 0 to 100% health, and then your damage is kind of being dealt more on like a math basis, so kind of like Pokemon games, or probably like JRPGs in general, actually just RPGs in general, RPG. So then you have like a bunch of modifiers that work on basic damage calculations, and then that kind of spits out a number, and that will chunk off, you know, X amount of health. And then you also just have like the generic number of hits. Whoa. Number O hits. And this is more of like a boss situation, so like you have to hit them with damage 3 times in order to move to the next phase or to finish the fight or whatever. The really common one, or I don't know, like the Bowser fights from Mario 64, where in the first 2 Bowser fights you have to throw him into a bomb once, and then in the final fight you throw him into 3 bombs. This one's not as common for the player, but I'm trying to think of games where that exists for the player. Maybe Sonic, because that's basically like you get hit once, you lose a bunch of rings and go down to like 1 ring, and then you're at 1 health. If you get hit again, then you go down to 0, and then if you get hit again, then you're dead. But you can like refill. I don't know. It's more of like an NPC thing. But anyways, all of these kind of have different aspects to them that make them function inside of their own games. And what I was saying with like this being useful for bosses, because it just kind of breaks things down into a simple, I don't know, into a simple situation. Makes it easier for players to understand what's going on. But you just kind of need to ask yourself, like, why would, like a Mario game want to do, like the power up thing, like if you get hit you're dead when you're small, but you can kind of change that. And does that fit more into what I'm trying to do versus a standard health bar and like doing a bunch of damage calculations? Like if I wanted to just have a simple combat system, where I just have like a sword and I just need to like, I just want to hit some stuff to clear it out as just like a minor challenge, rather than like it's very important that I manage all of my statistics and stuff, like then you're going to want to go with something that's more on like the number of hits rather than a health bar system. Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, I have thoughts on like the health bar stuff kind of feeds into, like, I think the number of hits for enemies can cover a lot of like what happens with health in games, because you want to like, I don't know, health basically okay, I'm gonna get into this. Health functions as like a way to give your players some outs to mistakes. So yeah, for the player, health equals mistakes allowed before failure. And for enemies / just NPCs in general, I guess, it's how many repetitions. Whoa. Repetitions. Yes, okay. To defeat. And so like the health system in like Zelda, I don't know, because this kind of gets tangled up into leveling systems, and I think that is going to be like that entire video that I want to do is health and leveling. But like if you kind of break down how you want to hit a loss state in your game, if you even want to, that's how you should analyze your health system. But for like your enemies, if you don't want to have like a really grindy, well, I guess if you want a really grindy experience, like how many repetitions you need to hit. So like how many times you need to mash the attack button versus like the light attack versus the heavy attack, or things along those lines. If you have a combat system where you're running through a bunch of combos to like create cool effects, and your team is more oriented on like visual styling, stuff like that, where you just want to show off like your character doing something cool, kind of like the God of War games, then you can put in a bunch of, that needs to be hit X amount of times to allow you to do a couple different combos to finish off a guy. But if it's, like a Zelda game where you, like an old school original Zelda game where you're just kind of like stabbing a dude, if you need them to take, like 20 stabs to die, but you're not really challenging the player, it's just going to feel really repetitive and grindy. So you just need to be aware of how that's all working together. And so like putting a health bar onto enemies, and then not really giving a way for like your player to increase the amount of damage so that the number of hits changes, so that they're doing more damage. You'll run into like what's the name of that game? The Division, where the like common enemies just have like huge, they're just like bullet sponges, and you're just like holding down the trigger into some guy who's just taking like 60 shots to the body to go down, and it's gonna feel very weird and unnecessarily prolonged. Anyways, I've gone way too deep into this. So yeah, I'll probably do a video on this at some point, but that's just kind of what I wanted to get at, is like what you're doing, what you're using for health for the player versus the enemies. Yeah, okay, so let's just try and move quickly because I think I'm getting close to time. So generally when I'm designing a system, I start off with just kind of like a generic neutral class, or just whatever like the base is. So you have kind of like this central starting point, and then what you can do from there is kind of just like, let's say you have, you know, a handful of different aspects in that class. And like if you think about this as like a civilization from Age of Empires, like these are the different units that can be made. Or it could be like, this is, you know, a general enemy unit, and they have health and stamina and damage and armor and blah blah blah. What you can do is you can, when you're generating different ideas, you just take this and you can either move stuff up or move it down. And you can do this with all the different things, but if you just scoot over one, that can give you an idea of what an enemy with more health feels like, or an enemy with less health feels like. And so what I'll do is I'll just do a positive, neutral, negative. Oops. Framework. And so that's just the, rather than doing like a big slider, like you could do somewhere on a scale of 0 to 10. But normally I'll just do like, you know, set this at a 5, and then I'll work on a 6 and a 4 difference as I'm just play testing the stuff, or just like experimenting to see what different things are going to work and not work. But then from there you can push extremes. Just to see where things break. Yeah, ran out of space. And yeah, so I don't know, this is kind of like a good range for testing and like initial sure. But then, you know, you can push those extremes later. And generally what I find with this sort of stuff is when you're pushing extremes, the like, let's say moving this stat to a 10 breaks the game, like it just becomes too overpowered. But then you kind of like wheel that back, and you find out that if you set that at, I don't know, let's say an 8, that this is a good spot, then you know that this is kind of like your cap, and you can have a unit, maybe it's a special unit or whatever, that sits right at this point, and that's like the power thing in your game. And so basically the closer to that edge that you get, the more powerful, more fun that thing is going to feel. Whereas the closer something stays to the center, the more balanced and more fair. More fair it'll feel. So that's generally what I do when I'm trying to lay out a bunch of different units to all work together, a bunch of different aspects of a system to work together. And yeah, you kind of want to figure out where in here is going to be kind of like those sweet spots. And so like if you're dropping things down to balance out, like let's say your damage is at an 8, but the speed is way down here at like a 2. These are going to be kind of like the knobs that you can tweak, but you're gonna want to start off with something that's like fairly simple, just to kind of give you an idea of what works and doesn't work together, and then from there you can push extremes and figure out where those breaking points are. And then you can use that knowledge of the breaking points to create interesting and high-powered stuff that feels just more fun to play around with. And then I guess just as a general note, if you're unsure, always err towards to more of whatever. I don't know, like what's coming to mind is like loot rewards, or just like general balancing, like nerfing of stuff, rather than pulling high-powered things down to the level of that like middle ground. Instead, nerf the weaker stuff up to the more powerful things. People generally like to receive things rather than have them taken away, and pulling power level down is just going to leave your stuff feeling not as strong. I've gone too long. Alright, let's do a quick recap. So we talked about like pulling your core aspects and how those are interacted with. By the player. And then I kind of went off on health. Oops. As an example. And then I briefly touched on using a positive, neutral, let's just go because we don't have a lot of space. Positive, neutral, negative. Kind of neutral framework. For kind of designing your initial ideas and seeing where your breakpoints are. And finding your kind of middle ground on ideas. And I don't know. I'm not sure if I really covered this like I wanted to.